I had the privilege of serving under Nelson Mandela in South Africa's first democratically elected parliament. This came after a history of over 350 years of racism and, of course, the apartheid system, which was a system of legally binding racial separation and oppression. When I see the plans for annexation of up to 30% of the West Bank in occupied Palestine, I cannot help but think of the South African apartheid system of homelands and Bantustans. Because what this annexation will do is it will make Palestine further fragmented, meaning the possibility of a Palestinian state gets reduced. It will give Israel and its quite brutal military and security services even more control over the daily lives of Palestinians. All of this is being undertaken in clear violation of both international law and UN Security Council resolutions. So it will further the illicit nature of the already illegal occupation of Palestine. Israel, with the Nation-State Act that defines citizenship on the basis of ethnicity, is unfortunately harking back to apartheid South Africa. The annexation of more and more of the occupied Palestinian territories reflects the homeland or Bantustan policy of apartheid South Africa. In some instances, the Israeli state has imposed a system of apartheid on the Palestinians in a manner more efficient than apartheid South Africa managed. This is, for instance, reflected in the reality that occupied Palestine is so easily controlled, is surrounded by walls and fences in many instances, but also that Israel has built separate roads for Israeli citizens and Palestinians, respectively, to use. Palestinian motor vehicles in Israel have different registration plates to those of Israeli citizens. So very sadly, having experienced South Africa, both growing up as a privileged white in the apartheid system, but also being involved in the struggle against apartheid with the ANC underground, and then serving in Nelson Mandela's first democratically elected parliament, and also experiencing Israel and the occupied territories both through my work on the global arms trade and as part of a delegation of South African human rights activists that visited the West Bank, the parallels are disturbing and overwhelming. Let us never forget, one of the greatest leaders the world has ever seen, Nelson Mandela, stated publicly that we are not free until the Palestinian people are free.
Like the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank, those territories
for us is really try to spell out the daily reality for a Palestinian living under occupation in the moments that don't necessarily make the news, when soldiers enter a Palestinian home in the dead of night. And people abroad might assume that they have a search warrant or probable cause or something like that. But no, military law gives almost any soldier the authority to enter any Palestinian home anytime, and the army does. And a million other ways in which Palestinians day in and day out have absolutely no control over their lives, have no representation in the Israeli institutions that determine everything in the life of a Palestinian, and to try and explain that, to give flesh and blood to the meaning of living under that regime, not for a month, not for a year, not for a decade, an entire people for more than half a century in that reality.
And there you're talking about the West Bank. In Gaza, people are being killed regularly. There's the Great March of Return protests that began on March 30th. And your official figures for how many people the Israeli military has killed since then?
Yeah, it's more than 170 fatalities. More than 30 of them were minors, under 18. 3 of them were actually children. They were 11 years old. These are the youngest ones that were killed since March 30, and more than 5,300 that were injured from live gunfire. But it's really important for me to emphasize that Gaza is also another example of Israeli control. Israel controls everything between the river and the sea. In Gaza, the control is external. We decide what and who gets in and out of the Gaza Strip, except of the Rafah crossing with Egypt that is closed most of the time. We control the population registry in Gaza. If you're a Palestinian in Gaza and need medical care, not necessarily even in Israel. You need medical care in the West Bank or in Jordan. Then, you need an Israeli permit for that. We control everything in different ways, directly or indirectly.
I wanted to ask you about Israel's plans to demolish the Palestinian Bedouin village of Khan al-Ahmar. On Monday, Israeli forces arrested 4 villagers, injured 7 people as they protested the arrival of the demolition teams. This is Bedouin villager Ahmad Abu Dahouk speaking last month.
We ask all the free people in the Arab nation to react. It is a war crime. The Israeli authorities want to demolish and evacuate us. Are they going to send us to a better place? No, they will not. They will relocate us to a worse place.
He is speaking from Khan al-Ahmar. Explain what this place is and what's happening.
So this is just a few miles east of Jerusalem in a part of the West Bank known as Area C. That's about 60% of the West Bank, and that's in an area that has...
Imagine a wall across your city, 8 meters high. A wall that blocks your access to schools, hospitals and loved ones. Covered in watchtowers, electric fences, cameras and military patrols. This wall exists in Palestine. My name is Mark Thomas and I have walked the entire length of the Israeli wall. On the West Bank side, on the Israeli side. It is the most barbaric, inhumane instrument that I have managed to ramble. Israel's wall cuts deep into the occupied Palestinian West Bank, confiscating land and appropriating water. The wall is devastating virtually every aspect of Palestinian life. It's now 10 years since the International Court of Justice declared the construction of the wall illegal under international law. Yet 10 years after that decision, Palestinian communities still continue to suffer. Exactly 1 year after the ICJ decision, fed up with international inaction, in 2005, Palestinian civil society appealed to people of conscience all over the world to act where governments have failed. They asked us to join their non-violent movement for boycott, divestment and sanctions. Many artists speak publicly of their support for a boycott of Israel, including Roger Waters, Alice Walker, Naomi Klein, John Berger, Judith Butler, Ken Loach, among others. War on Want supports the call for a boycott of Israel. We campaign to challenge the businesses, the British businesses, profiting from Israel's crimes. One such business is G4S. G4S supplies equipment and services to Israel's prisons, illegal settlements and checkpoints that form part of the wall. Help us to hold G4S to account. Working together, we can stop the wall and help end the occupation. Take action at waronwant.org/stopg4s.
Thank you. And floor goes to South Africa.
Mr. President, South Africa welcomes the distinguished delegation of the State of Israel to this UPR session and recommends that Israel, 1, recognize the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination as part of a two-state solution, including East Jerusalem as capital of a Palestinian state. 2, implement UN Security Council Resolution 2334 by immediately halting all settlement construction in the occupied Palestinian territory. 3, intensify efforts to address racism against Africans in Israel. 4, desist from abusing human rights defenders and cease the arbitrary detention of children. And 5, allow the people in the occupied Palestinian territory unimpeded access to water, food and medical care. Mr. President, my delegation welcomes the participation of civil society organizations in compiling Israel's national report. However, Israel is the only state in the world that can be called an apartheid state. We remain deeply concerned at the denial of the right of self-determination to the Palestinian people, in the absence of which no other human right can be exercised or enjoyed. In this regard, South Africa is of the view that the issue of East Jerusalem and the two-state solution are fundamental to the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. We respectfully remind Israel that in line with numerous UN resolutions and reports, it is bound by its human rights obligations towards the Palestinian people in the occupied Palestinian territory. I thank you.
I see Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to make a point of order.
It's unbelievable. The amount of stuff the amount of bombs you find. I mean, have a look at this. Have a look at this. And these are unarmed civilians here. Unarmed civilians. Mum, dad, grandparents, children. Oh, Jesus. Are you serious? Are you fucking kidding me? Mortal danger, military zone. Any person who passes or damages this fence endangers his life. Now that's a threat. That's I'm speechless. But I've got to tell you, look behind me again. This is Berlin. Berlin. We've got these things here, which is like being in a jail, and then you've got the wall. Yeah, this is a license to kill me. And I don't know, just up here, I think people should see, this is a tower. So they get up on the tower and they can take pot shots. What is wrong with the world? I'm speechless. Free Palestine.
But look, Matt, I know
that position on the Palestinians not that. So where should the Palestinians go to get accountability for what they claim to be problems? To Israeli courts? Where do they go?
Matt, look, we, of course, the United States is always going to stand up for human rights. We're always going to stand up.
Where do they go? Where do they go?
Matt, that is why I think that is why you have heard us continue to endorse and to call for a two-state solution to this long-running conflict. A two-state solution because it protects Israel's identity as a Jewish and democratic state, but also because it will give the Palestinians a viable state of their own and fulfill their legitimate aspirations for dignity and self-determination.
Where do they go?
The blowing up of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, in which 91 victims were killed, including 4 Jews. Israel was born out of Jewish terrorism. Jewish terrorists hanged 2 British sergeants and booby-trapped their corpses. Irgun, together with the terrorist Stern Gang, massacred 254 Palestinians in 1948 in the village of Deir Yassin. Today, the present Israeli government indicate that they will be willing, in circumstances acceptable to them, to negotiate with the Palestinian President Abbas of Fatah. It's too late for that, Madam Deputy Speaker. They could have negotiated with Fatah's previous leader, Yasser Arafat, who was a friend of mine. Instead, they besieged him in a bunker in Ramallah, where I visited him. It's because of the failings of Fatah since Arafat's death that Hamas won the election, the Palestinian election in 2006. Hamas is a deeply nasty organization, but it was democratically elected, and it is the only game in town. The boycotting of Hamas, including by our own government, has been a culpable error from which dreadful consequences have followed. The great Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban, with whom I campaigned for peace on many platforms, said, "You make peace by talking to your enemies." However many Palestinians the Israelis murder in Gaza, they cannot solve this existential problem by military means. Whenever and however the fighting ends, there will still be 1.5 million Palestinians in Gaza and 2.5 million more Palestinians in the West Bank, who are treated like dirt by the Israelis, with hundreds of roadblocks and with the ghastly denizens of the illegal Jewish settlements harassing them as well. The time will come, not so long from now, when they will outnumber the Jewish population in Israel. It's time for our government to make clear to the Israeli government that its conduct and policies are unacceptable and to impose a total arms ban on Israel. It is time for peace, but real peace, not the solution by conquest, which is the Israelis' real goal, but which is impossible for them to achieve. They're not simply war criminals, they're fools.
By the people from all over the world marching with them, by the people getting on boats, by the students here and around the world, and others that are taking up BDS. These are the ways that we, the people of the world, are going to hold Israel accountable. It is not going to be in the courtrooms. But what we seek from our courts is to say that our lives are important, and that foreign governments cannot abuse and kill, execute people, and not face justice for it. Because if the United States government submits a letter granting immunity to Israel for attacking Americans on U.S. soil, then who is safe and who is next? And people are going to continue to go. In fact, there is an all-women's boat being planned right now to sail to Gaza, and there's a representative of the women's boat to Gaza here somewhere. Susan, are you in the room? Oh, if you want to talk to her about the women's boat and supporting that, the effort of the people won't stop, but we definitely need to use the courts to at least deter or to provide some kind of deterrence, because otherwise, as we've seen, when there is no deterrence, the violence continues. And if there is no accountability, what is to stop Israel? And that's a true danger here. It remains to be seen, but as we hope that our national courts will be a place where we can get justice, but despite that, we will keep on. We will keep on. We keep on marching and we keep on sailing.
These far-right parties down to Trump and the Republican Party, and they've all become pro-Israel while holding on to this idea that, Jews really belong somewhere else.
And this is the whole notion of the Palestinians as immigrants. You have immigrants in Holland, and you have all the right to vote for a right-wing party because they are really Muslim immigrants and they create all the problem. We also have Muslim immigrants in Israel, and they're using the same methods to identify themselves, to operate politically and violently against our own culture, our own set of values.
Right. We understand the terrorism that you're experiencing. We have it ourselves.
And there's very worrying connections nowadays between the Israeli strategic advisors and experts and their counterparts in France, Britain, Holland, Denmark. They advise them how to control immigrant societies in order to preempt the next loner, the next
lone wolf.
Lone wolf.
And it's through biometrics and racial profiling and what do they call it? Micro expressions.
Micro expressions, and it's all built on this assumption. We all have Muslim migrant societies that did not fit in to the host culture.
Right.
And that's quite a challenge for us to. It's so false. It's almost like the kind of Nazi propaganda that you have such a big lie that the bigger the lie is, the more difficult it is then to diffuse it. It's such a big lie that I think at the beginning we're a bit paralyzed when we try to challenge it because it's so false. And yet I think we have to be patient and unpack it again for the audiences and make sure that people understand how ridiculous and dangerous it is for both case studies.
Ilan Pape, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I'm Max Blumenthal in Washington, D.C. for The Real News.
Part of settler colonial states like the United States, but are very familiar nowadays with their own history and understand their own origins, to understand that actually it's not exceptional. It's not exception. The only exceptional part of it is the denial, not the very historical act itself.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these myths are actually just Hasbara arguments by, in many cases, morons for the consumption of morons. But I found that in our world, there are a lot of, it falls on fertile soil. I mean, the education system isn't very good in the West. So you have these Netanyahu, and I think, this is kind of a common feature of Hasbara, trying to draw a distinction between settler colonialism and traditional metropole colonialism. And you'll hear him say, we're not the French colonizing Algeria. We have nowhere to go back to. This is our homeland, and we can't go back anywhere. How do you respond to that? And I think one of the things that we've failed to do is explain how settler colonialism is in many ways more pernicious than traditional colonialism.
Absolutely. The exceptional part of the story is that settler colonialism made certain connections or made certain assumptions which were accepted in the 19th century but looked ridiculous, inhuman, and non-democratic in the 20th century. And yet, in the particular case of Israel, they still remain valid. For instance, the claim that the only way you can create a democracy in a country which has settlers and natives is if the settlers are always the majority, which is the argument of the liberal Zionists, not the right-wing Zionists. The liberal Zionists, the whole peace process is based on the idea that the only way democracy can be sustained in Palestine is if the Jews are a majority in their own homeland.
Right.
So this is a ridiculous assumption that in any other context would be rejected as racist, but in the case of Israel is accepted.
Right.
And I think that's where the interesting part of the analysis comes into, I think, and also in my book, in the 10 minutes, why educated, well-read people in the West did not see this. Or did they see it and decided to accept it for reasons of guilt, anti-Semitism, because they didn't want the Jews to stay in Europe? God knows why. Everyone had their own reasons for that. For the second point that you were making, I think that it's very important to highlight when you talk about any settler colonial project, what Patrick Wolf called the logic of the elimination of the native. That you cannot create a new settler colonial society or a settler nation state from the settler colonial's perspective.
The movement which is violating each and every law of the Jewish religion and attempts to uproot religion from the masses of Jewish people. Authentic Jewish rabbis always opposed Zionism, and to the present day masses of Jewish people worldwide not only disagree with the State of Israel, but publicly oppose it. The State of Israel cannot and does not represent world Jewry or the Holy Torah, the Jewish religion. In no way do they speak in the name of Jews worldwide, or even in the name of masses of Jewish people residing inside the Holy Land. The State of Israel is illegitimate and criminal. It is a rebellion against God and a violation of the Jewish religion. It is a Nakba, a catastrophe for the Palestinian people, and a disaster for the Jewish people. Not only Palestinians suffer under the State of Israel, but the Jewish people suffer as well. As we speak, Jewish boys and girls are being arrested, beaten, and ordered to serve in an army they don't believe in. And those who stand up for them and protest are attacked violently by the Israeli police. Furthermore, Jewish people lived in peace with the Muslim neighbors in Palestine and in so many other Muslim countries. This peace was sadly destroyed by the invention of Zionism and the creation of the State of Israel. Jews worldwide are concerned for the suffering people of Palestine, for the endangered Jewish people in the Holy Land, and for the Jewish religion, which is so badly desecrated in the State of Israel. We promote a totally free Palestine. We demand that all rights should be returned to the Palestinian people. We clearly state that Jews would be far more safe, and the Jewish religion would be far better preserved under Palestinian rule over the Holy Land, rather than under this illegitimate, destructive State of Israel. Now, after 70 years of brutal occupation, the Palestinian Nakba is being taken to a new level with the recognition by the United States of Jerusalem as the capital of the State of Israel, and plans to move the American embassy there. We are very concerned at the possible danger this might bring upon the world, and we humbly plead with President Trump to rethink his plans for the good of all involved. We wish to make clear to him that authentic